The Shadow Army of the Battle of Gettysburg. Spectral Soldiers on the Battlefield. Have you ever heard about soldiers encountering creatures they couldn't explain during the war? Imagine, just for a moment, standing on the battlefield surrounded by chaos, the smoke of battle thick in the air. The deafening sounds of cannons and screams fill the atmosphere. But then, something different, something far more chilling. It happened one fateful night at Gettysburg, under the cover of darkness. A small group of soldiers, fighting for their lives, saw something that would haunt them forever. They were on this dark, moonless night. A squad of weary soldiers, exhausted from days of battle, took cover in the trenches. They could hear the distant rumble of cannon fire and the eerie silence between the bursts. As the men peered through the smoke and dust, they saw shadows moving on the battlefield. Soldiers. Only, they weren't like any soldiers they'd ever seen before. Their figures were hazy, translucent. Was it the smoke playing tricks on their eyes? Or was there something far more sinister going on? One soldier, Sergeant Jameson, couldn't shake the feeling. The shadows seemed wrong. They were not the living. They moved like ghosts, silent, swift, and without sound. As they approached the edges of the trench, one of the soldiers reached out to touch one. Oh, what were they? Were they soldiers lost to the battlefield? Or something more? The men, confused and terrified, fired their weapons, but the shots passed straight through the figures. They couldn't even hit them. And then, the shadows disappeared, as quickly as they had appeared. The soldiers were left stunned, speechless, as the night fell back into an uneasy silence. Was it just a hallucination, a trick of their minds under the stress of war? Or was something far more dangerous lurking on that battlefield, something from beyond the grave? But here's the strangest part. The only survivor of that squad, Corporal Miller, has never spoken a word about what really happened that night. He's lived a lifetime with this secret, and when asked about the shadows, he simply stares into the distance, lost in thought. Is it possible that these soldiers, these spectral figures, are still haunting the fields of Gettysburg? Could they be the spirits of soldiers long gone, trapped in a battle they can never escape? Or is there a deeper, darker force at work here? Stay tuned, because the truth behind these shadowy figures is even more mysterious than you could ever imagine. What if I told you this wasn't the first encounter, nor the last? What if these spirits weren't just haunting the past, but also the present? Keep watching, and we'll uncover the terrifying details, straight from the only soldier who survived that horrific encounter. Don't miss out. This story is just getting started. The soldiers weren't the only ones to witness the strange happenings at Gettysburg. Soon, others, including local farmers and even townsfolk, began to speak of eerie occurrences. But these weren't just rumors. People had seen things, heard things, felt things that could not be explained. It started with the lights. Late at night, a strange glow would hover over the fields where the fiercest battles had taken place. At first, it was dismissed as the flickering of campfires or the glow of distant torches, but those who ventured close to the battlefield found that the lights weren't coming from any fire. They hovered above the ground, dim and unearthly, as though they were searching for something. Sometimes they would pulse, grow brighter, then vanish without a trace. One local farmer, Mr. Thompson, told a chilling story. He had ventured out to his field late one evening, seeking his lost cow. As he crossed the boundary of the old battlefield, he saw a light drifting lazily through the trees, much closer than any torch he had ever seen. He thought it must be some fool trespassing on the land, but as he drew nearer, the light hovered unnaturally in place. It shifted sideways, as if it were alive, searching for something, someone. But it was what Mr. Thompson heard next that sent shivers down his spine. A faint, distant sound. A whisper? Maybe a murmur? It was hard to make out, but it was coming from the very spot where the lights had been. In the silence of the night, it felt wrong. He described it as voices on the wind, low and soft, but with an urgency behind them, as if the words were meant for someone else, someone from a different time. Not long after, another witness, a young soldier who had fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, told of hearing the distinct sound of marching footsteps in the woods in the same area where the lights had been seen. But when he investigated, no one was there. Just the rustling of trees, the faint smell of gunpowder in the air, and the oppressive silence that followed. But that wasn't all. There was something more unsettling. The shadows. The shadows weren't just seen, they were felt. Soldiers, even those who weren't involved in the original battles, claimed to feel an unnatural coldness when walking near the battlefield. It wasn't the chill of a winter's night. It was something more profound, a bone-deep coldness that would cause their breath to freeze in the air, even in the warmest months. One night, Private O'Reilly, a new recruit, ventured out toward the site, his curiosity piqued by the strange stories he'd heard. As he moved closer to the old cemetery, he felt it. The air grew thick and heavy, almost as if the ground itself was holding its breath. He paused, trying to shake the feeling. But then he heard the whispers, just faint sounds at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But they weren't leaves, they were voices, low, urgent, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, a shadow crossed his path. A figure, tall and gaunt, dressed in the tattered remnants of an old uniform. The figure didn't move like a living person. It drifted, its body appearing to shimmer like smoke. O'Reilly was frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for his rifle, but when he turned back, the figure was gone. What O'Reilly didn't know was that this wasn't the first such encounter. The local people knew of these figures, these spectral soldiers who appeared on the battlefield from time to time, fading in and out of existence. But it wasn't until O'Reilly's encounter that the rumors turned into something darker, something far more dangerous. Was this just a trick of the mind? Or were these apparitions, these shadows, the souls of soldiers long dead, still trapped in the hell of battle? What was it that caused these figures to appear? And why were they still wandering the fields of Gettysburg? And what of the strange light that seemed to guide them? What were they searching for? Were they looking for something they had lost? Or were they there to fulfill a mission, one that was left incomplete? But the questions didn't end there. The more the soldiers investigated, the more they realized that something far more ominous was at work here. These strange phenomena, lights, whispers, shadows, were not just isolated incidents. There was a pattern, a purpose. What was their purpose? What was calling them back to this cursed battlefield? Stay with us, because what comes next will bring us one step closer to uncovering the truth behind these spectral soldiers. Keep watching, and we'll take you deeper into the mystery of the Shadow Army, where the answers may lie in the very heart of the war itself. It's one thing to hear about strange phenomena from distant witnesses, but it's something entirely different when the survivor of those strange events decides to speak up. After all, how do you explain something that defies logic? Something so deeply unsettling that, for years, the only survivor refused to utter a single word about it. This survivor, Corporal Miller, was the man who witnessed it all. The only one left standing from the squad that encountered the Spectral Army on that unforgettable night at Gettysburg. His story is one of fear, confusion, and a truth that has haunted him for decades. Miller had been a young man when the battle broke out. He was barely 18, an eager soldier thrust into the carnage of war. But when he stepped onto the battlefield that day, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. What he had thought would be just another conflict between men turned into something far worse. It started like any other night, quiet, tense, the air thick with the scent of blood and gunpowder. But then, as Miller and his comrades took cover behind the remnants of a fallen cannon, something shifted in the atmosphere. The air grew unnaturally still. Still. No wind, no rustling of trees, just an oppressive silence that made every sound seem unnaturally loud. It was in that moment that the whispers started. At first, Miller thought it was just the wind, a trick of his imagination. But as the whispering grew louder, he began to hear phrases, words, distorted, indecipherable, but still words. His comrades heard it too, each one exchanging confused glances. Something wasn't right. Miller had heard the rumors of ghostly soldiers, tales spun around campfires in the dead of night. But these were just stories, right? Nothing more than campfire horror. At least that's what he told himself. But deep down, a nagging feeling tugged at him. Then the lights came. They were faint at first, tiny pinpricks of light hovering in the distance. But the longer Miller watched, the brighter they became. Not the glow of a lantern or a campfire. These lights were unnatural, shifting, pulsating with a rhythm that was entirely too deliberate, like they had a mind of their own. And that's when he saw them. The figures. At first they appeared as fleeting shapes, moving across the field like shadows cast by flickering flames. But they weren't shadows. No, these figures were real. Too real. Closer now, Miller could see them clearly. Men dressed in worn uniforms, faces obscured, their forms translucent, their edges blurred like smoke. It was like watching soldiers march out of the past. But these weren't soldiers from his time. No, these were the soldiers of a different war. A war that had ended long ago. Miller couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the figures, and his mind raced for an explanation, any explanation. Was he dreaming? Had the stress of battle finally broken his mind? But he wasn't alone. His comrades saw them too, and their faces were filled with the same confusion and terror. One by one, the spectral soldiers walked past them, marching in perfect synchrony, their eyes vacant, as if they were on some mission of their own, unaware of the living, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge them. The air grew colder with each step they took, and Miller's breath began to frost in the air. He could hear their boots tapping against the earth, soft, rhythmic. But no sound came from the soldiers themselves. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The figures vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the cold night and the heavy silence. For weeks, Miller said nothing. The memory of that night haunted him, but he refused to speak of it. What could he say? How could he explain it? Every time he tried to speak, the words stuck in his throat. The other soldiers who had witnessed the phenomenon were either too terrified to speak or had simply forgotten the events, their minds too broken by the horrors of war to comprehend what had truly happened. But Miller, he knew the truth. He knew that what they had seen that night wasn't just a figment of their imagination. It wasn't some trick played by the mind in the middle of a bloody battle. It was real. Years passed, and Miller tried to forget the shadows, the lights, the soldiers. But the past has a way of lingering, and the truth is never easily buried. Eventually, he broke his silence, though not willingly. He had been haunted not by the battlefield itself, but by the souls that still wandered it. In his own words, Miller confessed, "The war didn't end when the battle was over. Some of the soldiers never left. They still march those fields, searching for something. Maybe redemption, maybe peace, but they're never going to find it, not until they've finished what they started. It was then that Miller began to unravel the deeper mystery, the connection between the soldiers, the lights, and the endless march. And in the darkest corners of his mind, he knew that the battlefield was more than just a place of war. It was a place where the past and the present collided, a place where the souls of the lost and the living remained bound together by something far more powerful than death. And that is why Miller's silence, all these years, wasn't just a matter of fear. It was a plea to leave the shadows undisturbed, for fear that if the truth was uncovered, something far worse might be awakened. The question remains, what are these spirits still searching for? Is there something left unfinished on that blood-soaked battlefield? Or is the curse of Gettysburg far deeper than anyone could ever imagine? Miller's story is just the beginning. His encounters might be terrifying, but there are others. More soldiers, more witnesses, who have seen things beyond explanation. In the next parts of this story, we'll follow the investigation and the answers that lie waiting in the shadows of Gettysburg. The whispers didn't stop with Miller. They didn't stop for anyone. The shadows that had haunted that battlefield in Gettysburg, the same shadows that had sent chills down Miller's spine, were not just some one-time occurrence. They were something far darker, far more persistent. And the strange lights, they too would appear again, drawing others into the mystery, pulling them further into the abyss of the unknown. It wasn't just the soldiers who experienced the unexplainable. One by one, those who ventured into the heart of Gettysburg's haunted lands began to share similar stories. Soldiers, locals, even visitors. They all reported eerie happenings, each more terrifying than the last. Private Jameson, one of the younger men who had arrived at the battlefield a few months after Miller's encounter, was one of the first to notice that something wasn't right. He'd heard the rumors about ghostly figures, but he had always brushed them off as superstition. Until that night. It was late, the kind of night when the air seemed thick with an unspoken tension, when the usual sounds of the battlefield were replaced by an unsettling stillness. Jameson had volunteered to take a watch, believing that the sounds of the night would lull him into a peaceful rest. But instead, what he heard were footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably real. At first he thought it was another soldier, someone coming to relieve him from his shift. But when he looked around, there was no one. His heart began to race as the footsteps grew louder, drawing nearer. He strained his eyes in the darkness, trying to pierce through the thick veil of fog that had begun to settle over the battlefield. The footsteps seemed to circle him, then stop. And then he saw it, a flicker of movement just at the edge of his vision. A figure, cloaked in shadows, standing perfectly still. It was no soldier. Jameson's breath caught in his throat. The figure was not solid. It shimmered like smoke, its edges indistinct, as though it didn't belong to this world. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body froze, locked in place by the sheer weight of terror. The figure didn't move. Instead, it stood there, staring at Jameson with eyes that were dark, empty, lifeless. There was no sound except the pounding of his own heart, but the figure's presence spoke volumes. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't some benign spirit. This was something darker, something that didn't want to be seen. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, like smoke blown away by a gust of wind. Jameson's legs finally gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. He couldn't explain what he had seen. He couldn't even begin to understand it. But one thing was certain. Whatever had been walking the fields of Gettysburg wasn't human. It was something else, something that had been waiting, watching, for far longer than anyone could comprehend. The next day, he tried to talk to the others, but they dismissed his story. They called it nothing more than the product of exhaustion, of fear and stress, but Jameson knew better. The events he had witnessed weren't born from his mind. They were real, and they were growing stronger. It wasn't just Jameson who felt it. There were more reports, each more disturbing than the last. In another part of the battlefield, a group of soldiers found strange markings etched into the ground. Circular designs, symbols they didn't recognize, and what appeared to be footprints. Huge, unnatural footprints that had no clear origin. One soldier, Corporal Henderson, reported hearing strange noises coming from the forest surrounding the battlefield. At first, it was soft, just the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches in the wind. But then the noises grew louder, almost as if something was moving through the trees. His instincts told him to turn back, to retreat, but his curiosity kept him moving forward. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds became more distinct. Growls, low and guttural, followed by a piercing scream that sent chills down his spine. Henderson drew his rifle, stepping cautiously towards the noise, but when he broke through the trees to the clearing where the sounds had originated, there was nothing. No creature, no figure, only the unsettling silence of the forest. And yet, the feeling lingered, a sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of his sight. The strange occurrences were becoming impossible to ignore. The soldiers' nerves were fraying, and fear was setting in. What were they up against? Was it the restless spirits of the soldiers who had died on the battlefield, doomed to wander for eternity? Or was there something else at play here, something far older, far darker? No matter how hard they tried to rationalize it, the soldiers knew one thing for sure. The battlefield of Gettysburg was not just haunted by the ghosts of war. It was haunted by something far more malevolent, a force that they could neither see nor understand. Miller's warnings began to make more sense now. Perhaps these soldiers, these spirits, were not trapped in a battle they couldn't escape. Perhaps they were still fighting, still searching for something that would never come. And then, one night, it all came to a head. The lights appeared again. Closer this time. But this time, they weren't alone. The shadows returned. Not as fleeting figures, but as fully formed, walking the battlefield with a purpose. Their movement was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly real. It wasn't just the soldiers who saw them. Civilians, townsfolk, even tourists, all reported witnessing the shadows, walking across the land, their figures appearing out of thin air and fading back into nothingness. The whispers returned too, carried by the wind, but now they were no longer just voices. They were commands, loud and clear, as if the spirits were issuing orders to one another, preparing for something. Preparing for what, though? It wasn't until a local historian, Professor Langley, dug into the history of the battlefield that the pieces started to come together. The spirits, the lights, the whispers, they weren't just random occurrences. They were tied to the land itself, tied to the unfinished business of a battle that had never truly ended. Langley's research uncovered something chilling, an ancient ritual lost to history that had been practiced by soldiers before the Civil War. A ritual that sought to summon and control the spirits of the fallen, binding them to the land. But the ritual had gone wrong. Horribly wrong. The ritual was incomplete, and the spirits were never properly laid to rest. They were still there, wandering, waiting, forever bound to the battlefield. The more Langley uncovered, the more he realized that the battlefield was a focal point. a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, and whatever force had been unleashed all those years ago was still active. And it was growing stronger. The soldiers could feel it. The battlefield had become a prison, a battlefield not just for the living, but for the dead. And something told them. The shadows weren't just wandering. They were preparing for the final battle. A battle that would determine if the spirits would ever be freed. But who would win? The soldiers who had died fighting, or the forces that had trapped them in the first place? The truth, as it often does, remained buried under layers of time. But sometimes, the past has a way of clawing its way to the surface, like a shadow that refuses to fade. The more the soldiers and researchers delved into the eerie happenings at Gettysburg, the more they began to uncover something far darker, something far more ancient than anyone could have imagined. Professor Langley's research had revealed the presence of an old ritual, but that was only the beginning. As he pieced together more of the fragmented history surrounding the battlefield, he discovered an unsettling connection, a link between the spirits haunting Gettysburg and a long-forgotten chapter of American history. The ritual he uncovered was tied to an ancient, secretive group of soldiers who had been stationed at Gettysburg long before the Civil War. These men, some of the earliest inhabitants of the land, practiced a form of spiritualism and occult rituals designed to control the spirits of the dead. They believed that by binding the souls of fallen soldiers to the land, they could harness their power, granting them dominion over life and death itself. But something went horribly wrong. In the midst of one of their dark ceremonies, an unforeseen force had been unleashed, an entity far older and more powerful than any mortal had ever understood. The ritual, intended to summon and control the spirits of war, had instead opened a rift, a tear in the fabric between the living and the dead. This tear, once opened, never closed. And from that moment on, the battlefield became cursed, a battleground not just for the living, but for the souls of those long gone. As Langley dug deeper, he uncovered more chilling facts. There had been rumors of strange disappearances among the soldiers who had ventured too far into the cursed areas of Gettysburg, never to return. They weren't just lost in battle. They were lost to the rift, drawn into the same supernatural vortex that had claimed the spirits of the fallen. The local townspeople knew of these legends, though they had kept them hidden, fearing the wrath of whatever forces haunted the land. The whispers of those who disappeared became stories told around hearths and campfires, cautionary tales for children and strangers. But the true horror, the reality of the curse, had remained hidden until now. Langley's discoveries went even further, revealing that there was one particular night, the night of the final battle, that had been the true catalyst. It wasn't just the physical toll of war that had made Gettysburg infamous. It was the event that took place after the last shot was fired, when the bloodshed stopped and the battlefield fell silent. According to Langley's research, the spirits of those who had died in the battle, both soldiers and civilians alike, had been unknowingly drawn into the rift. Their souls, bound to the land by the failed ritual centuries earlier, had been awakened by the massive loss of life. The sheer magnitude of death that occurred that day had been enough to rip the veil even further, making it easier for the spectral soldiers to walk once more. But the real shock came when Langley uncovered a map hidden deep in the archives of an old military ledger. The map revealed locations on the battlefield, marked with symbols that corresponded to the very areas where strange phenomena had been reported. These weren't just random occurrences. They were tied to specific spots where the ritual had been conducted, where the veil between the living and the dead had been thinnest. And at the very center of it all was a particular area, a place marked by the oldest symbol of all, a sigil that was said to represent the gateway between life and death. It was here that Langley believed the final part of the ritual had failed. It was here that the spirits had been trapped, their restless souls unable to move on, forever bound to the cursed land of Gettysburg. The curse had a purpose, Langley theorized. The spirits, drawn from all walks of life and bound together by the ritual, were searching for something, not just redemption, but a way to finish what they had started. They were drawn to that same sigil, the key to their release. But the question remained, what would happen if they found it? What if the spirits of Gettysburg finally completed the ritual, unleashing a power far beyond anything anyone had ever imagined? As Langley pieced together these details, the atmosphere around Gettysburg grew even more charged. The lights grew brighter, the whispers louder. The shadows on the battlefield began to grow bolder, appearing more frequently and with greater intensity. And there was something else, something new. The soldiers who had once been so terrified of the apparitions were now beginning to feel watched. They could sense it, a growing presence on the battlefield, as though the spirits were aware that they were being uncovered. They were closer than ever. But no one could predict the outcome. Miller, the survivor who had been silent for so long, now found himself tormented by the events of the past. It was as if the curse was calling him back, dragging him toward the very spot where he had witnessed the first haunting shadows. Despite his fear, Miller knew that if the curse was to be broken, he would have to return to Gettysburg once more. He was the only one who knew the full truth, the only one who could face the spirits that had haunted him for so long. The answers lay hidden in the past, waiting to be uncovered. But could the soldiers, both living and dead, ever truly find peace? Or would the curse of Gettysburg continue to hold sway over the land, an eternal struggle between the past and the present? Miller's journey back to the battlefield would be the final test. And as the shadows grew darker and the whispers louder, one thing became clear. The past was never truly gone. It was still waiting. The battle had not ended with the final shot at Gettysburg. The ghostly warriors, the strange lights, the whispers, they were more than mere remnants of the past. As the soldiers and researchers delved deeper into the mystery, the tension grew unbearable. The field was alive with restless spirits, and the curse that had been awakened by the war was not going to let them rest. It began with the strange appearances. Soldiers, fresh recruits, some unaware of the battlefield's haunted history, began to witness unexplainable phenomena as they patrolled the area. What had once been considered just old war stories was becoming terrifyingly real. Sergeant Hayes was one of the first to experience it. A seasoned soldier who had served on numerous battlefields, he had always been skeptical of supernatural tales. He had walked through many a haunted forest, crossed many a cursed battlefield, and never once felt the fear others claimed to have felt. But Gettysburg was different. There was something about this place that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. One cold evening, Hayes stood watch near the infamous Devil's Den, a rock-strewn area that had witnessed some of the heaviest fighting during the battle. He was alone, save for the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground, cast by the setting sun. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, only an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on the air. And then he saw it. At first it was a flicker in the distance, a shape, not quite human, moving between the rocks. Hayes squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and moved with a fluidity that seemed wrong, like it wasn't quite real. His heart began to race, a familiar feeling of dread creeping into his chest. He called out, his voice hoarse in the dead air. "Who's there?" There was no answer. But the figure continued to move, now more clearly visible. It wasn't a soldier. It was an apparition. Translucent, its form shifting like smoke, with no clear edges, no solid features. Hayes could make out only the vague outline of a uniform, a ghostly, faded version of the soldiers who had once fought there. Suddenly, the air grew colder. A sharp wind seemed to whip up from nowhere, carrying with it the distinct smell of gunpowder. Hayes's breath misted in front of him, a sign that the temperature had dropped significantly in an instant. The figure stopped moving, standing eerily still, as if waiting for something. Hayes's eyes locked onto it, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee. But his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, caught in the grip of terror. And then, the figure vanished. As quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving Hayes standing alone in the growing darkness. The silence returned, but it was no longer the quiet of a peaceful night. It was a hollow, unnatural quiet that made every sound feel sharp and painful. What had he just witnessed? His mind raced, but the explanation wouldn't come. There was no rational reason for what he had seen. It didn't make sense. But Hayes wasn't the only one. Word spread quickly through the camp that strange figures had been spotted moving across the battlefield. Soldiers who had never believed in ghosts now found themselves wondering if there was something truly unexplainable at play here. The sightings were becoming more frequent, and they weren't confined to the darkness of night. More soldiers began to report seeing the figures, always distant, always fleeting. But it wasn't just the apparitions that troubled them. It was the sense that something, or someone, was watching them. The soldiers began to feel eyes upon them, even in the most secluded corners of the battlefield. There was an oppressive feeling, a constant sense of being surrounded by forces beyond their comprehension. Private Collins, a young soldier, experienced this firsthand while taking a walk near the old cemetery where the worst of the fighting had occurred. The cemetery was marked by overgrown graves and weathered tombstones, silent reminders of the many lives lost. Collins had been instructed to deliver a message to another unit, but as he approached the cemetery, he began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. He couldn't explain it, but he felt as though something was urging him not to step forward. Ignoring his instincts, Collins continued, his footsteps slow and hesitant. That's when he heard it. A faint whisper, just behind him. At first he thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. The voice was too distinct, too personal. He turned quickly, his rifle raised, but there was no one there. The cemetery was empty. But as he looked back, he saw something else. Shadows moving between the tombstones, figures that didn't belong. They were like the soldiers' spirits he had heard about in camp stories, walking through the graveyard as if they had never left. One of the figures turned its head towards him, and Collins felt a chill run down his spine. The eyes, dark, hollow, lifeless, stared right through him. The figure began to approach, slow, deliberate. But Collins couldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of danger. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished into thin air. Collins stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to comprehend what he had just seen. Was it real? Was he imagining it? He had heard the stories, but this was different. This wasn't a ghostly tale whispered by soldiers around the fire. This was something tangible, something he could feel, something that had a presence. The strange appearances weren't just isolated incidents. They were happening all around the battlefield. Every time a soldier ventured too far into the heart of Gettysburg, they encountered something unexplainable. And the more they tried to rationalize it, the more impossible it became to ignore. Something dark was stirring on the land. The spirits, once dormant, were awakening. But they were not the lost souls of soldiers who had perished in battle. They were something older, something more sinister. And they were getting closer. The presence on the battlefield of Gettysburg had gone from something distant and ambiguous to something unmistakably real. Soldiers, researchers, and locals were no longer just hearing stories. They were witnessing strange occurrences with their own eyes. And yet, despite all the evidence, the truth seemed just beyond reach. The more they tried to explain it, the more questions arose. Corporal Henderson, still reeling from his own terrifying encounter in the woods, had begun to seek answers. No longer willing to ignore the unsettling events, he decided to venture into the heart of Gettysburg with a group of soldiers, determined to uncover the mystery behind the eerie sightings and whispers. Armed with only their rifles, their courage, and a growing sense of dread, they ventured into the dark, uncharted parts of the battlefield where the spirits were said to be most active. The deeper they went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew thick with unease, and the once familiar sounds of the forest had been replaced by an unsettling quiet. As they approached the old cemetery, where Collins had experienced his terrifying encounter, Henderson felt a sudden pressure in his chest, a suffocating feeling as if the air itself was pressing down on him. He wasn't alone in his discomfort. His comrades, usually hardened by battle, exchanged nervous glances and their footsteps slowed. And then they found it. A set of strange markings on the ground, etched into the earth itself. At first, they appeared to be nothing more than random scratches, but as Henderson bent closer to inspect them, his eyes widened in disbelief. These weren't just random marks. They were symbols, ancient and unfamiliar, their shapes distorted but unmistakable. In the center of the markings, there was a large circle, and inside the circle a strange symbol, a sigil that Henderson couldn't decipher but somehow felt was significant. A cold wind whipped through the cemetery, lifting the hairs on the back of his neck. He turned to his men. "What the hell is this?" Before anyone could respond, there was a sudden, sharp crack, like a branch snapping in the distance. They all froze, straining their ears to listen. But there was no movement, no sound, just the quiet rustling of leaves. Henderson's heart began to pound as the realization struck him. They weren't alone. He reached for his rifle instinctively, but before he could raise it, a shadow appeared at the edge of his vision. It was fleeting, just a brief flicker of movement, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. The shadow was followed by another, and another. Each one seemed to emerge from the darkness, like smoke, fading in and out of existence. And then came the whispers, low, urgent murmurs that carried on the wind. The soldiers stood frozen in place, unable to move as the whispers grew louder. Henderson strained to hear, but the words were indecipherable, too distorted to understand. Yet, despite the lack of clarity, the voices seemed to resonate with something deeper, something primal. "Are they," one of the men whispered, his voice trembling, "speaking to us?" It was a question no one wanted to answer. And yet, Henderson felt a horrible certainty. These weren't just the spirits of soldiers lost in battle. These were entities, something far older, and their purpose was far darker. They were trapped in this endless cycle, unable to move on. The group began to retreat slowly, but the shadows followed them. At first, they moved just out of sight, lurking at the edges of the trees. Then, they grew bolder, closer. The soldiers' breath grew shallow, their hearts racing as they tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows disappeared. The whispers stopped. The wind died down, and the battlefield was silent once more, the oppressive air lifting, as though the darkness had momentarily lifted. But something was different now. The soldiers could no longer dismiss the events they had witnessed. These weren't hallucinations or tricks of the mind. There was something real, something dark, lurking on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The next day, Henderson and his men brought their findings to Professor Langley, who had been investigating the strange occurrences for weeks. Langley was immediately struck by the symbols they had discovered. He had seen them before, though not in a place he expected. These symbols were part of the ritual he had uncovered, a ritual that had once been used to summon and bind spirits to the land. But now, the symbols had evolved. They weren't simply marks of summoning. They were marks of imprisonment, drawn by the very force that had kept the spirits of Gettysburg trapped. Langley theorized that the ritual, which had gone horribly wrong centuries ago, had created a tear between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But now, it was not just the souls of the fallen soldiers that were trapped in this rift. Something far more sinister had been summoned, something older, something that had been waiting to return. As Langley pored over his research, another theory began to form in his mind. The spirits, once bound by the ritual, were seeking to escape, to break free from the curse that held them in place. But the more they tried to break free, the more they disturbed the fabric of reality itself, causing ripples that manifested as strange lights, shadows, and unexplainable events. But these manifestations were not random. They were signs. The spirits were trying to communicate, trying to reach out to those who might help them complete the ritual. It was the only way to break the cycle. The question was, could anyone really understand the messages they were trying to send? And then, something else occurred to Langley. If the spirits were trying to complete the ritual, what would happen if they succeeded? The thought made his blood run cold. The forces trapped at Gettysburg were not just restless spirits. They were gathering strength. And when they completed their task, nothing would be the same. The boundary between the living and the dead would be gone forever. The search for answers was no longer a matter of curiosity. It had become a race against time. The more the soldiers and researchers uncovered, the clearer it became that something far darker than they had ever anticipated was at play. The spirits, those spectral soldiers who wandered the battlefield, weren't just searching for peace or redemption. They were searching for a way to complete a ritual, and with every passing day, they grew closer to achieving their goal. The night was thick with tension as Henderson and Langley, along with a small team of soldiers, ventured deeper into Gettysburg's most cursed areas. The events they had witnessed, the strange lights, the shadows, the whispers, had only been the beginning. The curse that had been set into motion long ago was now drawing them in, pulling them closer to the heart of the mystery. There was no turning back. It was now a matter of finding the key to the ritual. But where could they find it? The answers were buried in the past, hidden within the landscape itself. Langley's research had shown that the sigils, the symbols etched into the earth, were more than just markers. They were directions. They pointed the way to the ritual's focal point, to the very place where the veil between life and death had been torn open. But they didn't know exactly where to start. The battlefield spanned miles, and countless areas were marked with these strange symbols. Henderson was determined to find the answers, but the more he investigated, the more overwhelming the mystery became. That night, they made their way to the area known as Cemetery Hill, one of the oldest and most iconic locations on the battlefield. This was where the fiercest fighting had taken place during the battle, and where, according to local lore, some of the most inexplicable phenomena were centered. As they approached the hill, a dense fog rolled in, enveloping them in an eerie shroud. The temperature dropped sharply, and Henderson could feel the weight of the air pressing down on them, as though the very land was holding its breath. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog. Every now and then, one of them would glance over their shoulder, feeling an unsettling sensation that they were being watched, though they saw no one. Henderson could almost hear the faintest whispers drifting on the wind, but when he stopped to listen, the sounds would vanish. It wasn't until they reached the summit of Cemetery Hill that they found it, the most distinct and powerful symbol yet. It was etched into the ground, carved deep into the earth, almost as though it had been branded into the soil by something otherworldly. The symbol was much larger than the others they had discovered, a massive circle surrounded by smaller runes and ancient markings. The ground around it had been disturbed, as though something or someone had been digging here recently. Langley knelt down to examine it closely, his eyes widening as he recognized the pattern. This wasn't just a symbol of summoning. It was the key, a key to unlocking the rift, to finishing the ritual that had been interrupted so long ago. "Here it is," Langley whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. "This is the place where the ritual began, and where it will end." But before they could move any further, the atmosphere changed. The fog thickened, and the whispers returned, louder this time, as if they were coming from all around them. The wind picked up, carrying a chill that cut through their clothing. And then, just as they turned to leave, the shadows appeared again. This time they weren't just fleeting figures. They were fully formed, solid shapes of soldiers, ghostly and translucent, marching across the battlefield with purpose. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate. They were not there by accident. They were walking toward the center of the ritual. Henderson could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been searching for. The spirits weren't just lost soldiers anymore. They were preparing to complete the ritual, to open the gateway that had been closed for so long. But what would happen if they succeeded? "Stay back," Langley ordered, his voice low and strained. "If they complete the ritual, we don't know what it will do." The spirits continued to march, undeterred by the living. It was as if they didn't even see the researchers or soldiers standing in their path. Their eyes were fixed forward, their expressions vacant, as if they were drawn to the symbol on the ground. They were going to finish what they had started. As Henderson watched the figures move closer, his mind raced. They were almost there, almost at the final moment. But could they stop it? Could they prevent the spirits from breaking through? Langley pulled out an old book, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. His eyes darted back and forth as he searched for the incantation that would stop the ritual. "It's in here," he muttered. "I just need to find it." The spirits were now standing directly over the symbol, their ghostly forms casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature dropped even further, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. And then, just as Langley found the incantation, the air crackled with energy. The rift was opening. But what would they unleash when they opened it? Would the spirits be freed, or would something far worse emerge from the depths of the rift? Henderson's mind raced with fear and uncertainty, but there was no time to think. The spirits were almost there. As the spirits gathered around the ancient symbol, Henderson could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The air was thick with energy. Something ancient and powerful was stirring, and they were right at its heart. They had crossed into dangerous territory where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred, and there was no turning back. Langley's voice trembled as he chanted the incantation from the old book, his words growing louder and more frantic. But the spirits didn't pause. They stood around the symbol, their movements slow and deliberate, their hollow eyes locked onto the ground beneath them. They were already beyond the reach of the living, too far gone to be stopped. Henderson felt a sense of hopelessness wash over him as he watched the spirits, their translucent bodies flickering like old film reels. Every inch of him screamed to run, to leave before whatever was about to happen unfolded. But he couldn't. Not now. The fog swirled around them, thickening, twisting as though it were alive. And then the shadows moved. Not like before, fleeting, passing in the corner of their vision, but as solid, tangible forms, as if the very earth had given birth to them. They surrounded the soldiers and researchers, blocking off any escape. The whispers returned, louder, clearer, as if they were calling out in unison. The voices were no longer incoherent murmurings. They were speaking directly to Henderson and the others. "Leave!" they hissed in unison. "Leave, or be bound!" The chill in the air grew unbearable. Henderson's breath came in sharp, painful gasps as his skin prickled with an icy coldness that seeped into his bones. He looked around, expecting to see his comrades just as terrified, but they were too mesmerized by the unfolding scene to move. The ritual wasn't just about summoning spirits anymore. Something far older, something far more malevolent, was awakening. A force that had been lying dormant for centuries, trapped beneath the surface of the battlefield. And then it happened. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the earth itself seeming to split open as a rift began to form. A crack in the very fabric of reality. The symbol at the center of the gathering began to glow, a sickly green light that cast long, unnatural shadows across the battlefield. The spirits, once faint and translucent, now became more solid, their features more defined. They were no longer the lost soldiers of Gettysburg. They were something else, something ancient and terrifying, their forms twisted and contorted, no longer human. From the rift, a dark shape began to emerge, a massive, shifting mass of shadow like smoke, but with eyes that burned through the darkness. The very air seemed to bend around it, warping and twisting with unnatural force. Henderson could feel it, a presence so overwhelming, so utterly alien, that it made his skin crawl. This wasn't just a spirit. This wasn't just an ancient soldier. Whatever this was, it was something that had been waiting, watching. It was something that had been summoned by the ritual, and now that it was free, nothing would stand in its way. Langley, in his panic, recited the incantation again, but it was too late. The words no longer held power. The ritual had gone too far. The spirits were no longer under control. They were no longer even trying to return to the grave. They were creating something new, something beyond comprehension. The rift widened, and with it, the shadowy figure emerged fully. It was a creature of darkness, a mass of swirling blackness that seemed to devour the very light around it. Its form was indistinct, shifting constantly, but there was no mistaking the feeling of malice that radiated from it. It was not of this world. It was not a spirit, nor a ghost. It was something older, something that had been born from the deepest shadows of time itself. The soldiers stood frozen, unable to move. Their weapons were useless against this force. Langley, his face pale and frantic, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" one of the soldiers whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the force that the ritual was meant to control," Langley gasped. "A being of pure darkness, bound to the land, waiting for the rift to open." But it was too late for explanations. The dark figure shifted, and with it, the very ground seemed to warp around them. Henderson could feel the air grow heavy, oppressive, as though the atmosphere itself was being sucked into the rift. He could hear the faintest of whispers, not from the spirits, but from something else. Something that was not human. The creature reached out, tendrils of smoke-like darkness stretching toward them. The soldiers, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the dark mass surged toward them, swallowing up everything in its path. Henderson closed his eyes, bracing for impact. But the sensation never came. The rift had consumed the battlefield, and with it, their reality, and then everything went silent. The winds stopped, the air cleared, the shadows retreated. And when Henderson opened his eyes, the battlefield was still. The spirits were gone. The creature was gone. The rift had closed. But something was different. The land was no longer haunted by restless spirits or ancient forces. It was quiet. Still. Too still. But Henderson couldn't shake the feeling that they had not truly won. The darkness had receded, for now, but it hadn't been defeated. And as he looked around at the faces of his comrades, he saw the same look of uncertainty mirrored in their eyes. They hadn't escaped. They had merely been spared for a time. "Is it over?" one of the soldiers asked. "I don't know," Henderson replied, his voice hoarse. "But I don't think this story has ended yet." The air around Gettysburg had returned to a sickening calm. The rift had closed, the shadowy figure vanquished, or so it seemed. But in that eerie silence, Henderson knew that the battle was far from over. The darkness had not been destroyed. It had simply receded into the depths, retreating momentarily, but leaving behind a lingering presence. The soldiers who had witnessed the horrors were left questioning the very fabric of their reality. Had they truly escaped? Or had they simply opened a door to something far worse? As Henderson and the remaining soldiers made their way back toward the camp, their steps were slow, hesitant. Each of them kept their eyes forward, unwilling to look over their shoulders. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were watching, waiting. Langley, his face pale and drawn, was the first to speak. "I thought we could stop it. I thought the ritual could be undone, but that creature, whatever it was never meant to be controlled. It was just waiting for the right moment to break free." Henderson nodded grimly. "But what happens now? Do we just walk away? Pretend it never happened?" "No." Langley's voice was resolute. "The rift may have closed, but something is still here. That creature, that force, is tied to this land. The spirits we saw, those weren't just soldiers. They were part of something much older, and I fear they are not done yet." For the first time, Henderson looked at his comrades. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale, as if they were all struggling to understand what had just happened. They had witnessed the impossible. The dead had risen. The boundaries between worlds had been breached, and an ancient force had nearly torn through their reality. "We've got to get out of here," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice shaking. "Before it comes back?" But Henderson knew they couldn't just leave. Not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, and the whispers he had heard, those dark voices on the wind, lingered in his mind. Were they still out there, waiting to complete their unfinished mission? "We can't run from this," Henderson said, his voice steady but heavy with resolve. "We need to find out what's truly going on here. We've only scratched the surface." But even as he spoke, a sense of dread began to take root in his chest. It wasn't just the spirits or the rift. It was the land itself. The battlefield had been forever marked, and that mark was not just spiritual, it was physical. The more they explored, the more they realized that Gettysburg was not simply haunted. It was a place where time itself seemed to bend, where the past and the present collided in ways they couldn't fully understand. As they made their way back to the camp, the air grew thick once more. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The leaves rustled unnaturally, like the whispers of the past were stirring, waking once more. The soldiers could feel it. The land was alive, its very soul intertwined with the curse that had been unleashed. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble, like distant thunder, reverberated through the earth. They all stopped, their hearts racing, their eyes scanning the darkness. And then it happened. From the woods, a figure emerged, dark, mist-like, and twisting. It wasn't a soldier, it wasn't human, it was something far worse. A mass of shadows, constantly shifting, its form flickering like a broken image. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it were aware of its power. It stopped in the clearing before them, and the air grew cold, so cold that their breath came out in frosty clouds. One of the soldiers, his face pale and trembling, stepped back. "What is it? What is this thing?" Langley's voice cracked. "It's not one of the spirits. This is the force we've been sensing. The one that created the rift. The one that's been waiting for centuries." The creature turned toward them, and in that moment Henderson could see its eyes, dark, empty, and filled with an endless hunger. It wasn't just a manifestation of the spirits. It was something older, something far more powerful, and it wasn't bound by the same rules as the spirits of Gettysburg. This entity could exist between the realms, between life and death, and it had no intention of staying hidden any longer. The soldiers took a step back, their weapons trembling in their hands. What could they do? What could stop this thing? And then, as if sensing their fear, the creature stretched toward them. A shadowy tendril shot out, wrapping around a nearby tree, and with a sickening crack, the tree was ripped from the earth, its roots twisting and snapping like brittle bone. The creature was toying with them, showing them its power, reminding them of their helplessness. But Henderson's mind was racing. He remembered the sigil, the symbol they had found earlier, the key. Langley had said that the ritual had been meant to control the spirits, but had gone wrong. What if there was a way to reverse the ritual? What if the sigil was the answer to stopping this thing, once and for all? "Langley," Henderson shouted. "The sigil, the one we saw at the center of the ritual. Do you think it could stop it?" Langley's eyes widened. "It's the only chance we have. If we can reach the symbol, we can try to reverse the ritual. But we have to act quickly." Without another word, Henderson turned and sprinted toward the clearing, the creature's presence looming behind him. He could feel its dark energy closing in, its weight pressing down on his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the spot where the symbol had been marked on the ground. As he knelt beside the sigil, his fingers trembling, he saw that it had begun to glow once again. The dark force was still active, still feeding off the rift. But this time, Henderson knew what he had to do. He traced the edges of the symbol with his fingers, his mind racing with the incantation Langley had read aloud earlier. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him. The shadows closed in, and the creature's tendrils reached out. But as Henderson whispered the final words, something happened. The ground beneath him began to rumble again, but this time it wasn't the rift that was opening. It was the earth itself, shifting, turning. The sigil flared with light, pushing back the shadows. The creature howled, its form distorting, its dark presence weakening. The curse was being undone, but was it too late? The earth shook beneath their feet, the once serene battlefield now an active force of destruction. The sigil was glowing, pulsing with light, as if the very land had become alive, fighting to close the rift, to push back the ancient dark force that had been unleashed. Yet Henderson and Langley knew that this was just the beginning. The creature, that monstrous presence, still fought to maintain its hold on Gettysburg. Its tendrils lashed out, as if desperate to keep the ritual from being undone. But as the light from the sigil grew brighter, Henderson felt the heavy weight of the darkness around him begin to recede. The creature's whispers, which had once been a cacophony in his mind, began to quiet. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could hear the sounds of the wind, of the leaves rustling, the natural world reclaiming its space, pushing back the oppressive force that had claimed it for so long. The soldiers, their faces pale and grim, stood ready to defend themselves, though their weapons were useless against the supernatural force they were fighting. Their eyes were glued to the sigil, watching with a mixture of fear and hope as the glowing symbols began to pulse more rapidly. Langley's voice broke the silence. "It's not enough. We need more. The ritual wasn't just about control. There's something hidden beneath the surface, something we haven't uncovered yet. There's one more piece." Henderson turned toward him, his mind racing. "What do you mean? We've been through the symbols. We've done everything you said." Langley's eyes were wild with determination. "We're missing the final piece, the one that's been left out of every record, every history, the key to closing this forever. It's tied to the land itself." The ground beneath them trembled once more, and Henderson's heart sank. The creature's shape was shifting again. Its form swirled like smoke, darkening the already dim battlefield, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "It's trying to stop us," Langley said, more to himself than anyone else. "It's trying to prevent the ritual from being completed, but we can't stop now." With that, Langley motioned for Henderson to follow him. Together they made their way toward a secluded part of the battlefield, where the land felt strangely different. The air seemed heavier, the earth beneath their boots more solid, as though it held a secret waiting to be uncovered. They reached an old oak tree, its bark weathered by centuries of storms and battles. Langley stopped, his hand brushing against the tree's surface. "This is it," he murmured. Henderson stared at him, confused. "What's it?" "This tree," Langley said, his voice trembling. "This oak has stood here for hundreds of years, long before the battle even began. And it holds the final piece of the ritual, the secret that ties the land, the spirits, and the curse together." Henderson's heart pounded as Langley moved closer to the tree, running his fingers over the bark. With a soft groan, the tree seemed to respond. A section of the bark shifted, revealing an ancient engraving. The symbol etched into the tree was the same as the one at the center of the ritual. But this one was different, more intricate, with more layers, more detail. Langley turned to Henderson. "This is the heart of the curse. This tree is the anchor. It's where the ritual started, and it's where it must end." Henderson's breath caught in his throat as he realized the enormity of what Langley was suggesting. They weren't just trying to close a rift. They were trying to sever the tie between the land and the darkness, to finally end the curse that had plagued Gettysburg for centuries. But it wasn't going to be easy. The creature, sensing that the end was near, began to howl, its voice carrying across the battlefield. The earth shook violently, the ground splitting as the shadowy mass began to surge toward them. The sigil at the center of the battlefield flickered, its glow dimming, struggling against the force of the darkness. Langley gripped Henderson's arm. "We need to act fast. If we don't do this now, it'll be too late." With shaking hands, Langley traced the new symbol on the tree, his fingers moving along the ancient grooves. As he did, the air around them seemed to vibrate, a low hum echoing through the land. The whispers became louder once more, but now they were different, more desperate, more chaotic. And then, with a final push, Langley pressed his palm against the tree. There was a sudden flash of light, so bright it nearly blinded Henderson. The ground trembled once more, the very earth groaning in protest. For a moment, everything went still. The battlefield, the trees, the air, it all hung in suspended animation. And then, the creature screamed. The sky itself seemed to darken as the shadowy figure writhed, its form breaking apart as though it could no longer hold together. The force that had been holding the battlefield in its grip began to crumble, and the rift, the dark tear between life and death, began to close. The soldiers watched in stunned silence as the dark creature was pulled into the earth, its form vanishing into the ground as if it had never existed. The land groaned one final time, and then everything went quiet. The oppressive air lifted. The whispers ceased. The sigil at the center of the battlefield flickered one last time, and then it, too, disappeared. Henderson could hardly believe it. The curse had been lifted. The rift had closed. And the spirits, the soldiers who had wandered the earth, trapped in the endless cycle of battle, had finally been freed. But there was one question that lingered in Henderson's mind, a question that no one had an answer for. What had the creature been? What had it really wanted? And had they truly stopped it? Or was it simply waiting for its next opportunity? As the team gathered around the old oak tree, Henderson looked up at the sky. The stars were brighter than they had been in days, the night air cool and clear. For the first time in a long while, the battlefield of Gettysburg felt peaceful. But Henderson knew better than to think it was truly over. The land had borne witness to unimaginable horrors, and some scars run deeper than time can heal. The sun had barely risen over Gettysburg when the first signs appeared again. It was subtle at first, a fleeting shadow in the distance, just at the corner of one's vision. Then the whispers began again, faint and eerie, but distinct enough to send a chill down the spine. The soldiers, once jubilant with the hope that the curse had been lifted, now found themselves plagued by the same unsettling phenomena that had haunted them before. Henderson stood in the early morning light, the air still with the lingering memories of the battle they had fought, not just against the forces of darkness, but against their own fear. They had fought to close the rift, to free the spirits of the fallen soldiers who had wandered the land for centuries, and for a moment, it seemed they had succeeded. The battlefield felt quieter, as if the very earth had exhaled after holding its breath for so long. But now, the old, familiar feeling had returned. The land was shifting once again, as though it were restless, still burdened by the weight of its past. "It's happening again," Langley whispered from behind him. Henderson turned to face him, his heart sinking as he saw the expression of concern on the professor's face. The air was thick with tension, and the faintest whispers could still be heard on the wind, though no one else was around. "I thought we closed it," Henderson said, his voice taut with frustration. "I thought we stopped it." Langley shook his head slowly. "We did close the rift, but the land, it's tied to something older, something beyond what we understood. The ritual may have been undone, but there's still something here, something deep within the earth itself. The land hasn't fully healed." Henderson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What does that mean? Is the creature coming back?" "I don't think it's the creature," Langley said, "but whatever it is, it's connected to the land, to the curse. It's like we've only touched the surface, and the deeper we dig, the more we uncover. The balance is still fragile." The soldiers, who had been moving cautiously through the battlefield, began to grow visibly nervous. They, too, had felt it, the change in the air, the shift in the atmosphere. They had seen the shadows move once more, and they had heard the whispers return, growing louder with each passing moment. As the day wore on, the signs became harder to ignore. The trees that had once seemed so still were now unnervingly silent. The birds, which had sung the morning away, had vanished. The earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though something was stirring beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Henderson and Langley, along with the soldiers, decided to investigate once more, venturing back to the site of the ritual. The air had grown thick, heavy with the weight of their expectations. They were no longer afraid of the dark. They had already faced the worst of it. But this was different. This was a lingering, insidious threat that seemed to be growing stronger by the hour. They reached the spot where the sigil had once been, the place where they had fought to close the rift. The ground here was different, scarred by the battle they had fought. But now, the earth was cracked, as if something had moved beneath it, causing the very soil to shift. "It's not over," Langley muttered. "We closed the rift, but something has taken root. The land itself is cursed, and it's trying to heal, but it can't." Henderson knelt beside the crack in the earth, his fingers brushing against the jagged edges of the fissure. He could feel a strange energy emanating from it, a low hum that seemed to resonate in his chest. "We've got to stop it before it spreads," Henderson said, his voice grim. "We can't let this continue. If whatever's buried here is allowed to grow, there's no telling what might happen." Langley nodded, his face drawn in worry. "We need to find the heart of it. Whatever this is, it's tied to something deeper than just the spirits of the soldiers. It's something ancient, something that predates the battle itself. It's not just about the curse of Gettysburg anymore. It's about something older, something that was buried long before we even set foot on this land." As they spoke, the ground beneath their feet trembled once more. A sharp crack echoed through the air, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping against the earth. Suddenly, the crack widened, and a dark figure began to emerge from the depths of the earth. It was no longer just a shadow or a fleeting vision. It was real, solid, tangible, and unmistakably malevolent. Henderson's heart stopped in his chest. The figure was larger than any spirit they had encountered before, its form dark and shifting like smoke, but with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. It was a creature of pure darkness, not bound by any earthly constraints. And it wasn't just an apparition. The rift hadn't been fully closed. The force that had once been contained had found a way to break free again, and it was more powerful than before. "Get back!" Henderson shouted, as the creature's tendrils lashed out, sweeping across the battlefield. "We need to stop it now!" Langley, his voice steady despite the terror rising in his chest, reached into his bag. "We've got to use the sigil again. It's the only way to contain it." But before they could act, the creature surged forward, its tendrils wrapping around the soldiers, pulling them toward the gaping rift. The ground cracked open wider, and the sky seemed to darken, as if the very air were being drawn into the abyss. Henderson gripped his rifle, his mind racing. They had stopped the ritual once. They could stop it again. But the creature was stronger now. Its power was growing. "We can't let it break through," Langley said, as he and Henderson backed toward the tree where the sigil had been. "We have to complete the ritual. Now!" But as the creature howled and thrashed, its presence grew overwhelming, and Henderson realized that the land wasn't just haunted by spirits anymore. It was alive with something far worse. And this time, there might be no escaping it. The land of Gettysburg had become a battleground once again. The creature, an entity born from the darkness that had long plagued the earth, thrashed wildly, its tendrils writhing in the air like serpents, seeking to claim its territory. Henderson and Langley, along with the remaining soldiers, stood firm, backs pressed against the tree where the sigil had once been. They had come too far, witnessed too much, to turn back now. Langley's face was grim, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "We need to finish what we started. The sigil, We need to use it, but we can't just trace it. This time we have to activate it fully. Only then can we stop it for good." Henderson nodded, his heart racing. He could feel the presence of the creature pressing down on them, an overwhelming sense of dread that clouded his every thought. The creature's eyes glowed with a dark fire, as if it could see their every move, anticipate their every action. "We need to act quickly," Henderson said, his voice low and tense. "We're running out of time." The soldiers were already preparing themselves, their rifles raised, but they all knew deep down that the creature could not be fought with weapons. It was beyond anything they had ever faced, a force from a realm they could not comprehend. It was not a mere spirit or a shadow. It was a living manifestation of darkness, tied to the land and the rift they had tried to close. Langley turned to Henderson. "We need to combine the power of the sigil with the ritual's final incantation. We need to reverse the forces that were unleashed, but if we don't do it right, we'll only make it worse." Henderson's mind raced as Langley knelt and began to trace the sigil once more, his fingers moving quickly, each stroke an act of desperation. The ground beneath them trembled, the rift threatening to open wider. The creature howled, its form expanding as it surged toward them, its tendrils wrapping around the very fabric of the battlefield. The air felt charged, like a storm waiting to burst. But then Henderson felt something different. It wasn't just the weight of the air or the intensity of the creature's presence. It was a pulse beneath his feet, a rhythmic thrumming coming from the very earth itself. The sigil at Langley's fingertips began to glow brighter, its energy rising, as if the land itself were responding to their efforts. Langley paused for a moment, his hand trembling. "It's working," he murmured. "The land, it's reacting to the sigil. We have to finish it now." With a deep breath, Langley pressed his palm to the sigil, his voice rising as he recited the final incantation, the one they had uncovered in the ancient texts, the one that would close the rift for good. Henderson could feel the air vibrate with energy, a surge of power that seemed to come from every corner of the battlefield. The creature let out a deafening scream as the sigil's light flared to life, its tendrils writhing in agony. It was as if the very land was rejecting it, pushing back the darkness that had claimed it for so long. The ground cracked, and the sky seemed to darken further. But then, suddenly, a brilliant light erupted from the sigil, blinding them all. Henderson's heart raced, his instincts telling him to look away. But he couldn't. He had to see it. He had to witness the end. The creature's form began to fracture, its body twisting and contorting as if it were being pulled apart from the inside. The tendrils writhed in agony, and the dark eyes, glowing with malevolent light, began to fade. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath as the very air was torn asunder by the light from the sigil. And then, with one final deafening scream, the creature was gone. The rift, too, began to close, its edges slowly sealing, the light fading as the land returned to its natural state. The oppressive weight that had hung over the battlefield began to lift, the air clearing, the whispers finally falling silent. For a long moment, no one moved. The battlefield was eerily quiet, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only noise. The soldiers, their rifles still raised, slowly lowered them as they processed what had just happened. The land had returned to a peaceful stillness, the curse finally broken. But the question still lingered in the air. Had they truly stopped the creature? Or had they only delayed the inevitable? Henderson stood still, his heart still pounding in his chest, as he looked around. The battlefield was no longer the place of nightmares it had once been, but it was still Gettysburg. And as the fog began to clear, the first rays of the morning sun cast light on the land, light that seemed to cleanse the darkness. Langley stood beside him, his face pale and exhausted, but his expression softened as he looked at the battlefield. "It's over," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We did it. The rift is closed, the creature is gone, and the spirits, they've finally been freed." Henderson nodded, but the weight of the past lingered in his mind. "I hope so. I really do." As they stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, they all knew that Gettysburg would never be the same. The land had borne witness to horrors beyond comprehension, and though the curse had been broken, the memories of the past would always remain. And though the rift had been closed, Henderson knew that the mysteries of Gettysburg were far from finished. The battle might have ended, but the land would never forget. The battlefield of Gettysburg had finally fallen silent. The dark force that had plagued the land for centuries had been sealed away, but as the sun rose over the horizon, a sense of uncertainty still lingered in the air. The rift had been closed, the creature banished, and the spirits fried. But even with all that, something remained, something far deeper, a part of the land itself that could never be erased. Henderson stood alone at the edge of the battlefield, watching the first rays of sunlight break through the morning fog. The once oppressive air had cleared, leaving behind a strange peace that felt almost unnatural. It was as though the land was holding its breath, waiting to see if it had truly been freed or if the darkness would return. Langley approached him, his footsteps light but weary. "I never thought it would come to this," he said quietly. "The land, Gettysburg, has always been a place of great power. And now, I don't know what to think. The ritual, the rift, it's all tied to the land itself, but I still don't fully understand it." Henderson nodded, his mind racing with the events of the past few days. "We closed the rift. The creature is gone. The spirits are at peace. But you're right. There's something about this land, something we still don't fully grasp. I can feel it. It's like the earth itself is watching us, waiting for something." Langley looked out at the battlefield, his gaze distant. "The truth is, Henderson, we may have closed the rift, but we've only scratched the surface. The land of Gettysburg, it's tied to history, to the very essence of this country, and some wounds, some scars are deeper than time can heal." Henderson turned to him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Langley met his gaze, his expression grave. "The rift, the curse, it was just one part of something bigger. The spirits we freed, the creatures we battled, they weren't just part of a single event. They were part of the land's history. Gettysburg isn't just a place where battles were fought. It's a place where time itself is fractured. The past and the present, the living and the dead, all coexist in a way that we don't fully understand. And as much as we've done, I don't think we've truly undone the damage." Henderson's heart sank as Langley's words sank in. "You're saying the land's curse might never truly end?" "I'm afraid so," Langley said softly. "The curse was not just about spirits or creatures. It was about history itself, the trauma, the suffering, the lives lost on this land. Gettysburg has always been a place of great power, and that power, that energy, has become entangled with the very fabric of time." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The battlefield stretched before them, empty and peaceful. But Henderson couldn't shake the feeling that the land still held something beyond their understanding. It was as if the earth itself was scarred, its wounds too deep to fully heal. The rift might have closed, the creatures banished, but the land would always carry the weight of its past. "We've done everything we can," Langley said finally. "But history has a way of repeating itself. And when it does, we'll be ready." Henderson turned to face him. "Do you think it will come back? The creature? The curse?" Langley hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I can feel it in my bones. Gettysburg is not just a place of war. It's a place where the past is never truly gone. It lingers, it waits, and sometimes it comes back." Just then, a faint whisper carried on the wind, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Henderson's heart skipped a beat. It was the sound of voices, distant and soft, as if the spirits of the past were calling out from the depths of time. The whispers were not angry or terrifying, but mournful, filled with a sadness that transcended life and death. Langley glanced at Henderson, a knowing look in his eyes. "There will always be whispers. Always." The two of them stood together, gazing out at the battlefield, the quiet of the land surrounding them. The rift had been sealed, the dark force banished, but the truth of Gettysburg remained. The land was alive with history, with memories of battles fought and lives lost, and no matter how hard they tried to erase it, the past would never truly let go. The sun rose higher, casting its light over the fields where soldiers had once fought, where darkness had once consumed the land. And as the light bathed the battlefield in its golden glow, Henderson realized that the true battle was not over. It was a battle between the past and the present, a battle for the soul of Gettysburg itself. And in the end, no matter how hard they fought, no matter how many rituals they performed, the land would always remember. The scars would always remain. The morning light cast long shadows over the now quiet battlefield of Gettysburg, and as Henderson and Langley stood together, a sense of calm settled in. The creature was gone. The rift had closed. The spirits were finally at peace, or so it seemed. But the land still felt alive. It was as if the very earth, soaked in blood and history, could never truly forget. The whispers had faded, but Henderson couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered beneath the surface. The strange occurrences, the flickers in the corner of the eye, the sudden coldness that crept up on them, the unnatural stillness, had subsided, but they hadn't vanished. The land had been marked, scarred by a history too vast and powerful to simply erase. It wasn't just the past that haunted Gettysburg. It was the weight of everything that had happened there. The countless lives lost, the pain, the grief, the darkness. Henderson turned to Langley, who stood silently beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of everything that had transpired seemed to sit heavily on his shoulders. "I thought we could stop it," Henderson said, his voice tinged with doubt. "But now, I'm not so sure. This land, it feels like it's never going to let go." Langley nodded, his expression solemn. "I warned you, Henderson. This place has seen too much. The rift may have closed, but the echoes of the past will always remain. The curse, it's not just about what happened during the battle. It's about the land itself. Gettysburg is a place of power, and power never disappears. It simply waits." Henderson glanced back at the battlefield, his eyes tracing the scars in the earth, the old trees, the hills where the blood of so many had been spilled. Despite everything they had done, despite the victory they had claimed, it felt as if Gettysburg was still holding its breath, waiting for something more. "Do you think it's over?" Henderson asked, the weight of the question pressing on him. Langley's face darkened. "It may be over for now, but Gettysburg will never be truly free. The curse has been lifted, yes. The rift has closed, but the land itself, its history, its pain, cannot be erased. And one day it will call to those who listen. It will always return. The cycle never ends. History repeats itself, and the land will always remember." Henderson shivered, feeling the weight of Langley's words settle in his chest like a cold stone. Then what do we do? Langley gave a heavy sigh. We endure, we live with it, and when the time comes again, we fight. The truth is, Gettysburg is a place of power, and like all places of power, it will always attract those who seek to tap into that energy, those who want to control it, manipulate it. The land will always test those who dare to disturb it. The battlefield stretched out before them, quiet now, the early morning light casting a soft glow on the scars that still marked the land. But the darkness had not fully lifted. There was still something lingering in the air, a presence that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. Henderson couldn't ignore it. No matter how much they had accomplished, how much they had closed, the land still held its secrets. You think the curse will come back? Henderson asked. Langley turned to him, his face full of gravity. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. When the land calls, those who listen will always come. The wind picked up, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper across the field. Henderson strained to hear it, but the words were lost in the wind, as though the land itself was speaking, warning them. The presence, though faint, was still there, just beneath the surface. Remember, Langley said, as if hearing the whisper too. History will always return. It's not over, not yet. Henderson looked at the battlefield one last time. The scars would remain. The echoes of the past would always linger. No matter how much time passed, the land would carry its stories. And sometimes, when the time was right, those stories would resurface. But for now, there was peace. The land had been healed, at least for a time. They had closed the rift. They had fought the darkness. But the warning hung heavy in the air. The curse had not been completely vanquished. It had only been delayed, and the land would remember. Always. The story may have ended for now, but the mysteries of Gettysburg will never truly fade. Do you think the curse is gone for good? Or will it return one day? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The land may be quiet now, but who knows what stories it still holds. This final part of the series brings closure to the immediate story while leaving a lingering sense of unease. The battle may be over, but the curse is never truly vanquished. The land's power, its history, and its darkness remain, creating a sense of ongoing mystery that keeps the audience thinking long after the story ends. Let me know if you'd like to explore any specific details further, or if you have any other requests.